So what we are going to do today is to examine some practical exercises to go through this ladder that I presented in my talk. We are going to explore the ascent from the desire mind to the illumined mind. We said that the wisdom mind, buddhi manas, is when the illumined mind becomes constant. And that's something that happens in initiation. And so our work as aspirants is to work on these levels. So let's get right to it. Let's look at the first step, from the desire mind to the lower mind. Now, this is not quite like a ladder in the sense that you always have one step on one foot on one particular step. We go through the whole range of consciousness, and what matters is how much time and energy and identification we spend, let's say, on each of the levels. So in some occasions, we may be acting from the desire mind. On some other occasions, from the illumined mind. What we are trying to do is to work less from the desire mind and more from the higher states. But as we are dynamic beings, you can expect that there will be fluctuation. So let's see the first step. So this is a text from Blavatsky talking about the purification of desires. Because if desires are very strong, they are powerful to drag the mind, to move the mind in the direction of desires. So part of the work that we are trying to do is to purify desires. So she says, when desire is for the purely abstract, when it has lost all trace or tinge of self, then it has become pure. So you see, losing the trace or the tinge of self is what makes it pure. The first step towards this purity is to kill out the desire for the things of matter, since these can only be enjoyed by the separated personality. So you see, for example, when we desire material things, because of the nature of material things, when we have something, we are depriving somebody else from having that. So there is a cake, I take a slice of the cake, that slice is not available for somebody else. Same with the resources. Resources are limited. So people, countries, communities, they can hoard resources, depriving others from having some of that. And this is something that is inevitable. And this is the basis of the survival for of the fittest, as Darwin would put it, the competition, etc. So she says the first step to purify desire is to diminish your desire for these things. This is in opposition to the idea of desiring, as we are going to see, some higher objects. For example, if you desire knowledge, the more knowledge you have, you are not depriving other people from that knowledge. On the contrary, if you have some generosity, the more knowledge you have, the more knowledge you produce, the more knowledge you share. So there are some psychological, let's say, objects of desire that are not necessarily limited as the material objects are. Now, because we live in a materialistic age, we turn even the psychological objects of desire, let's say, into material ones. Because, for example, people who have knowledge often sell that knowledge and get money from that knowledge and accumulate material possessions. We are transmuting something that is per se is not material, like knowledge, into materiality. So you have an artist. This artist can produce beautiful art and share a perception of beauty, etc. And on that level, there is no competition for resources or anything. But the moment we make art into a business, then a great artist turns into, again, gathering resources that may be taken away from others. Now, this is inevitable to some extent. We have to live. We have a physical body, and we need the money and the shelter, etc., to survive. But I want to point this out because, in principle, these psychological objects of desire would not produce the kind of competition that the material ones produce. So this is what Blavatsky continues. The first step is to cease desiring those things. The second is to cease from desiring for oneself even such abstractions as power, knowledge, love, happiness, or fame, for they are but selfishness after all. So you have these two steps. You start working on desiring less the material, and how do we work on that? It's not just by repressing desire. We all know that that is not effective. What the Theosophical tradition proposes, and Annie Besant has written about this a lot, is you try to desire something that is higher. You transmute desire. You start placing your attention on a higher field of life. So from a person that is focused on the material and possessions and what house you have, what car you have, how many of them, and then if you want to purify desire, what you start doing is begin to appreciate these other objects of desire, like, for example, knowledge. We can talk also about spiritual objects of desires, like virtues, power, which you can use that power to help. If you use that power to gather material things for yourself, then we are down in the material level. But the first step to purify desire is to begin to desire more these non-material aspects. And that's more or less what happens as you join a spiritual community. You start reading about, appreciating these higher objects. You start valuing them. You live with people who value more these things rather than the material things. So gradually you can produce a purification of desire in that sense. Now, as Blavatsky says here, this is also self-centered. Desiring power, desiring knowledge, love, etc. As long as there is that tinge of self, is still self-centered, is still selfish from a philosophical point of view. So even this, we need to gradually, once we are there on that level, we need to start making a shift and appreciate these things for what they can do to help others. And that's how we start purifying the tinge of self. And again, you don't repress desire for these things. In the New Age is very much about happiness, my happiness. How can I be happier? So the New Age often it's in search of these things, but kind of self-centered. Of course, say New Age is a very broad term. There are all kinds of movements within the New Age. So I'm talking just generally. Now, what would make that search theosophical is when you turn that search into seeking for tools to help others. And that's what helps us in the purification of desire. Now, there is something important. Blavatsky will point out that it is wisdom what helps you realize this. So she says, life itself teaches these lessons, the fact that you have to get beyond your desires. For all such objects of desire are found Dead Sea fruit in the moment of attainment. That's a phrase that says, you grab it and then just escapes you. This much we learn from experience. If we live with a learning mind, we know this. We know how many times we have desire, how many things, and we attain that, and we think that now we can be happy, And that happiness may last for a second, for a month, for a year, but then we get bored or we get used to that, or suddenly new desires appear that says, wait a second, I'm not really happy, I want more. So she says, if you go through life intelligently, you will learn this. You will learn that pursuing objects of desire end up is not satisfactory. And then she says, when you realize this, there is an intuitive perception. I mean, this is a negative realization. Negative, philosophically speaking, is the realization of this is not leading me anywhere. But you don't know what is going to lead you somewhere that is satisfactory. So the first part is that negative perception. And if you stay at this level, you become cynical, you may become disengaged, you may say nothing matters. If everything is changing, why would I bother? But then if you try to remain engaged with life, learning, comes the second step. Intuitive perception seizes on the positive truth that satisfaction is attainable only in the infinite. The will makes that conviction an actual fact of consciousness, till at last all desire is centered on the eternal. So this is the stage in which we begin to move beyond desire. When we realize nothing that has form, nothing that is impermanent, none of those objects, whether physical, psychological, or so-called spiritual, will per se make you happy. The only thing that will bring satisfaction, let's put it that way, is to live in the eternal, to realize your eternal nature. And that's what is the secret of happiness. Not pursuing external objects, finding that you are eternal, and in that eternal nature there is intrinsic happiness, love, wisdom, etc. So you see, there is a lot of talk in the New Age about manifesting your desires and using your thought power and your willpower to manifest your desires. From a theosophical point of view, that is based on a complete misconception of where happiness really lies. It's another materialistic endeavor to attain objects of desire, perhaps by other means, by non-physical means, and that's why some people may think this is a spiritual action, but you are just pursuing desires of objects that are outside of yourself, and that life will teach you that even if you are successful in manifesting what you want, you won't find happiness there. But then we need that intuitive perception. So as an exercise, I think something we can do is to look areas in our lives where we have a desire that we don't think is healthy, that we want to move beyond it. So you can engage in a period of self-examination and see what kind of desire brings you frustration or sorrow. And then once you identify that desire, work with an ideal. So try to see how you can transcend that desire. I'll give you a simple example, and it's the simplest and it's the least relevant, really, from a spiritual point of view. But suppose that you don't eat well. I mean, I'm not saying that it's okay not to eat well, but the spiritual development. I always talk about don't lose perspective. Some people, their whole spirituality becomes about what they eat, and they don't pay attention to their motivations, thoughts, emotions. So I'm talking, from that point of view. But let us put this example that is easy. You are not eating well, and you want to eat better. So you have the desire for the piece of cake, and you want to cultivate a desire for eating an apple. Well, that's not going to quite work in that way. But how would you work to, change the object of desire? Well, what you have to do is to start spending time, energy, contemplation, time contemplating, maybe associating with people who value physical health, for example. So you start generating a desire for physical health. And how do you do that? By reading about it, by talking with people about it, by participating in groups where they work in that field, so that gradually being physically healthy becomes to you more important than the desire to eat the piece of cake. So you see how you proceed with the transmutation. So when you identify a desire that you want to work on, it's a similar process. You have to try to identify what is the ideal, the higher ideal that can replace it, and start working on it. Maybe you can work on virtues. If you have a desire, try to see why you have that desire, what is the need, what is the lack. And because in our spiritual nature we are full, we are complete, we have the antidote in our own nature, but it's not unfolded. We have not realized that aspect of our nature. So what you do is to identify the virtue that would replace that desire and start meditating on it, reading about it, maybe reading biographies of people who have shown this virtue. You don't need, in the Theosophical view, it's never needed to work with what is wrong or with the flaw or with the defect. You always work at stimulating the opposite goodness, because that will take all the oxygen of the weakness. So there is no need to enter into a conflict with whatever you think is not healthy and you want to get rid of in your system. You just focus on stimulating the higher. So that would be the basic technique for that part of purifying desire. Any comments or questions about this?
Pablo, where are these quotes from?
This is called Desire Made Pure. It's in the collected writings number 8, if I remember correctly, from HPB. But if you Google Desire Made Pure Blavatsky, you will find the article.
How about desire for a person? Is that something, it's not material, but is that something that also needs to be sublimated or transmuted?
Mm-hmm. Yes, but that doesn't imply what you may think. So what happens when you desire a person? You desire a person because there is a lack in yourself and you expect that person to fulfill your lack. So your relationship with the person is one of manipulation, is one of exploitation in a sense. I'm using harsh words, but this is sadly what we are doing. I am with you, I'm expecting you to make me happy, and when you don't act in the way that I need, then there is conflict, and then I ask, and then I claim for what I'm expecting you to do. So desire in a relationship is always an obstacle. Desire is the cause of conflict. Now, we can work to transmute the desire for real love. I mean, in our consciousness, because we are complex beings, there is a part of what we feel that is pure love. There is a part that is desire. There is a part that is fear or prejudice, right? So what we need to do is to start focusing on the love part. When we love, real love, what is this feeling that we want the other person to be happy. We want to give the person. We want to be united with the person in the sense of communion, not because I need it, but because there is this longing for oneness with the person. So you can start working on meditating and reading and doing practices that have to do with enjoying the happiness of the person we love. Of course, if we are full of lacks, that is not going to be quite effective. So we have to work on ourselves. We can only love if we are free to love. So we need to work on ourselves to touch that part of ourselves more and more, that part that is complete, that part that is full, is filling up the voids. And then the more we do that, the more we are free to give, to love, and to enjoy sharing your life with another person without strings attached. So that would be more or less the path.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to phrase this question exactly, but how much do you have to rely on personal will, and how much do you rely on other than personal will?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And it comes down to this, to this subject that has been touched about the 7 rays. So in the Theosophical view, when our monads are emanated from the Logos, they emanate through one of the 7 rays. And depending on what ray the monad emanates, that will be the tendency of our consciousness. Now, there is another aspect of the rays is how our bodies are. The monad has its own ray, the permanent atoms that form the bodies has its own ray. So that monad has to learn, that consciousness has to learn to express through the body that all the bodies will belong to another ray. And then the personality has also some karmic forces, and that's the 3rd level of the rays. So what will work for you depends on the interaction of these 3 levels. So for some people, it's just will. And that's a wonderful path. It's normally a hard path in a sense, but that's wonderful because it's straight, it's just simple, and it said, I don't want this, that's it. That's it, and you drop it. But at least in the Theosophical tradition, people from the 1st and 2nd rays are not the more numerous ones. Most people belong to the lower 5 rays. Lower not in hierarchy, but in number. Then there is the other aspect, you use wisdom. That's mostly for people of the 2nd ray. So you use wisdom, which is what HPV is saying here. If you pay attention to the suffering, you pay attention to the unsatisfactory nature of things, that discernment, that wisdom moves you naturally against or in the right direction. In that one, there is no conflict. And then, if you go down the rays, each one of them have a particular approach. Some is out of love and devotion. You just give up the desires because you love the divine, you love humanity, or etc. So how that will happen in your consciousness really is different for each person. So the process is more or less the same, but it's important to know this because most organizations, they teach one particular approach. And therefore, only the people who agree with that approach can be helped by that approach. In the Theosophical Society, because we try to generate a universal brotherhood, we try to have approaches or bear approaches, different approaches, so that people of any kind can benefit from it. Now, individuals may fail to be that broad-minded because each of us belong to one ray or one approach, as Kurt was saying, and sometimes it's hard to understand the needs of another person. But I think it's suspect from anybody that tells you this is the universal answer to everybody and everything. The more custom-made a method can be, the more effective it is. And that implies, of course, your responsibility. It needs your responsibility, your intelligence, your active engagement, rather than just following what somebody says.
In a way, actually, you answered to my question with your previous answer. But it was indeed to have a bit of a clarification on because you said the Theosophical approach is not to deal with what is there, but in a way replace it with something that is higher. But in a way also it seems that there is this part of like natural understanding of what things are about. So, for instance, if I like to eat a piece of cake and I eat a piece of cake regularly, and if after that I do not feel well, then after some time I will realize that this is actually not good for me. So I don't have to replace cake with an apple, or try to replace a cake with an apple, but through seeing what the object is in itself, and as you said, that it has this insatisfactory nature or an impermanence or whatever that is, that we don't need to replace this something else, but when there is this kind of natural observation of what we are going through and what we are experiencing, we can also let go things in a natural way, that we don't have to replace one thing with another, but just by seeing the nature of the thing, that, hey, this thing finally, it's not good for me, then naturally also it drops away. So just I'm very glad that you clarified in that sense. And if you wish to add anything else to that, then I think it's good, because people are very different and we can function in a very different way.
That's basically the method of wisdom. So a person that in whom that ray is strong, that's how you work. You work through wisdom, like Shankaracharya says, detachment or vairagya, not detachment in the psychological way, but this freedom from desire comes naturally when your discernment shows you what is real and what is unreal. So if you are on that path, you don't need to replace. In general, diverting your consciousness from the level in which it is engaged to a higher level helps the transition, for people. And when we say you don't work with the negative, you work with the positive, that doesn't mean that you don't try to understand the negative trait, that you don't recognize it, that I don't mean that. You work on self-knowledge, you recognize it, you understand it, but then you don't get caught in fighting with it and being guilty about it and trying to shun it. No, leave it alone. Once you understand it, stimulate the opposite, and then that's how it's normally proposed. All right, we do need to keep moving. So the second aspect, so this was to go from the desire mind to the concrete mind. So there is a need for mental growth. What I'm going to present now in these sections are all quotes from Annie Besant from different places. The reflection of intellect, that is how she called the higher mind, the abstract mind. This is how even today philosophers, especially when they study Greek philosophy, that's how the nous is translated, as the intellect, the higher mind, and that's how Besant is using it here. So the reflection of the higher mind, the abstract mind, is the lower or concrete mind. And until the concrete mind is developed, the intellect, the higher mind, cannot find its full evolution. So you see, often in spirituality, there is the idea that the mind is an obstacle, and therefore you have to get rid of the mind. But that's not normally the Theosophical approach. The mind, what we call the mind, the lower mind, the concrete mind, is necessary for the evolution of the higher mind. Now, of course, the lower mind can become an obstacle if all your life and energy and sense of being is on that level. Then it blocks the possibility of spiritual development. But if you want to develop the higher mind, then the lower mind has to be healthy and healthily developed. That doesn't mean you have to be a scholar or, you have to be able to think properly. You have to have some fundamental understandings that allow you to relate to life more from the point of the real than the unreal. You need a healthy lower mind. And she says now the one condition, whether for the lower mind or for the higher mind, the higher intellect, The one condition of progress is complete unfettered liberty of thought. That is a lesson that we all need to learn. So a theosophist or an aspirant to this should always strive to think outside the box. Outside the box in politics, outside the box in your spiritual life, outside the box everywhere. You need to encourage your intelligence, your perception, and of course you have to be mature about this. It's very easy to challenge every view and not build your own understanding. What we need is to intelligently say, okay, let me see. So is this true? I don't know. It sounds okay. It makes sense. Let me see. You know, it's helpful sometimes to try to find examples for things. So when you are dealing with a concept and you are trying to see if you really grasp the concept, well, think of an example in nature that may be an expression of that or a reflection of that principle if we are talking about a spiritual principle. Create your own understanding. That's how the lower mind grows. And if your objects of thought, of contemplation, are spiritual objects, spiritual concepts, truths, realities, you will be not only developing the lower mind, but also the higher mind, because those are the objects of the higher mind. So Besant says, one of the most marked things in the Theosophical movement, and this was written in the 1910s, I think. So at the time, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for people to engage in intellectual understanding. So I think today that's the TS is not, you know, unique in this, but this was quite very much so at the time. So one of the most marked things in the Theosophical movement is the mental growth observable year by year in its members. This is largely due to the fact that they are taught the nature of thought and set themselves to build their mental bodies instead of leaving them to grow by the unassisted process of nature. So this that we are talking about, and we will see some practical approaches, this is doing what Annie Besant is saying. Take your growth in your hands and apply your intelligence, your will, to go in that direction. She would always say yoga, as a spiritual approach, yoga is taking the laws of nature and applying them in an intense way to produce intense results. Humanity will develop the mental body in a few million years. Now, if you know the laws behind how you develop this, and you apply your attention, your time, your will, you can accomplish that development in a few thousand years as opposed to a few million years. Well, maybe little less of 1,000 years. But, you know, in the Theosophical view, we incarnate if we are spiritual, but not too spiritual. If we are too spiritual, we often incarnate very, very soon because the world needs help. But if we are spiritual, we incarnate every 2,000 years, 1,500 years. So, you know, 10,000 years is just 2 or 3 incarnations. Anyway, so the idea is to learn the laws and to apply them. And this is what she says. To develop your mind, you must study. Now, by study, I do not mean the reading of books. I mean thinking, pondering over, reflecting on what you read. You may read a dozen of books, and your mind may be as feeble as in the beginning. So it's not just accumulating information. It's not going through the pages like, I don't know who brought that story of a guy that said, you know, I read The Secret Doctrine 7 times. Okay, that means nothing per se. You know, how did you study that? Did you take your time? Did you meditate on it? Did you ponder, contemplate, question? You know, then, okay, you surely may have developed your mind. If it was just reading, your mind may be as feeble, and I would add something, as feeble but more confused as in the beginning. Probably we all know some people like that, that have a lot of information but very confused. But, she says, if you have read one serious book properly, then by slow reading and much thinking, your intelligence will be nurtured and your mind grow strong. One serious book, that's another thing. We shy away from weighty books, from books that bring, transcendental concepts. In this age, we want something easy. And Annie Besant's book were the easy books at that time. Now they are complex, but sometimes she would say, I'm trying to explain all this very easily, and I always feel some guilt because I'm making it too easy for people. But then most people don't have the willingness to really work with text. So, and now we are at a point where Besant's books are difficult to understand for many people. But in any case, whatever is your level of understanding at the time, just get a book that makes you think, that makes you struggle, but struggle with joy. This is, as I said in my talk, is a spiritual gym. You are going there to exercise your intelligence, your perception, and you will grow more and more intelligent, not intellectual, more and more intelligent, being able to understand life, to understand yourself. So she continues, in order that you may fight against this modern tendency of scattering thought, which is probably worse now than at the time, you should make it a daily habit to think consecutively and to concentrate your attention for some time on one subject. Make it a serious practice in the training of your mind to read every day some part of a book that deals with the graver matters of life, with the eternal rather than with the transitory. So this is a practice. Get some book that fulfills those conditions, and spend every day, maybe you can separate half an hour a day, if not half an hour, 15 minutes, read one paragraph, and then close the book and think about it. Rephrase what you read, put it in your own words, draw examples, analogies, as I said. Try to see what are the different aspects in what the speaker is saying. I mean, you can take any, if the book is really a book with wisdom, we could take one paragraph and do a 1 hour lecture, drawing from all the things that come out of that single paragraph. So that's what we gradually develop, the ability to read into what the author writes a lot more than is in the pages. Besant would explain, when we say something, when we write something, it's just a summary of the thought form. The thought form is connected to many things, but of course you cannot do that in the book or in speaking. I mean, HPV used to write like that. That's why she's kind of flow of consciousness, and she writes everything that is connected to her thought. But that's difficult to follow for many people. In any case, this is your exercise. Set aside a time in your day where you sit with a deep book, read a paragraph or two. If that paragraph contains an idea that you feel is an important idea, just close the book, think about it, ponder over, write down your insights, ask questions, question the text, try to answer your questioning. That's the practice. So she says, fix the mind upon it while you are reading. Do not allow it to wander. Do not allow it to scatter. If it travels off, bring it back and place it again on the same idea, and in that way you will strengthen the mind. See, that's also very often the case that we go off tangents of what the book is saying. So try, if you are reflecting on the paragraph, reflect on what the paragraph says. Sometimes, it's very common that we read something and there is a word that catches our attention, wonder, let's say, and then you start thinking, or sometimes this happens in lodges, and then you start discussing the word wonder and what wonder means, and that we should wander like in the tarot card, the wanderer, and then you end up thinking about the word wonder that in a context that is not what the author is saying there. So this is a tendency of the mind that we need to learn how to check and stay focused on the concept that the author gave. Then after your exercise, you can wonder about the wanderer. That's fine. But focus during the exercise. So any thoughts?
Books. Now, there's a concept for you. What about videos, podcasts, other forms of getting knowledge, and how to deal with those?
Yeah, I think they are fine. Again, we are all different. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, but if it is something deeper, I need to read it. That I'm that kind of person. Other people are the opposite. They need to hear it. So there are audiobooks, and videos are fine too. You can stop the video and think about it. Of course, when you are speaking, like if I were to write what I'm presenting right now, then I can go far deeper than what I can do in a oral presentation. So sometimes lectures may be less deep than books, but of course it depends on your level, it depends on the speaker. I would say use whatever gives you food for pondering, for meditating.
So with regard to this study, and perhaps it's implied here, but can you speak a little bit to the manner in which we should direct the mind? And what I'm thinking is, when I try to do this and I sit down, and perhaps it's wandering, but many of us may be sitting down to study at the beginning of our day and we are anticipating what's to come, or perhaps at the end of the day and we have things that are sort of simmering in our minds. So to what extent is it a hindrance, or perhaps is it actually helpful when we are studying to relate it to what may be going on personally in our lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you are truly relating it, then that's part of the study. If let's say you are taking off the concept and then you start thinking about your day and all that, I mean, it may be helpful because you are reading, your state of consciousness may be a little higher, and then you think about something of your life and maybe you have a different insight that may be helpful for your life. Now, that kind of wandering is not that helpful for the growth of the mind. So the idea, something that is important, will is the ability to refrain the natural movement of the personality. So we develop will by telling the mind, not now, we are focusing here. Also emotionally, you may desire something, and if you recognize this desire is not appropriate right now, I mean, I want an ice cream, bye everyone, I'll go get an ice cream. So you say, no, not now. So I think for the growth of the mind, we need to make our best effort to stay with the subject. If that illuminates your day, perfect, great. But don't be frustrated. The mind will do that. So just do like Besan says here. When you realize that, just without frustration, without self-violence, you say, oops, I've been somewhere else doing my grocery list. Okay, let's come back.
So we're on the subject of mental growth. My question, I understand the Theosophical perspective is that all traditions we can draw things out of. My wife, she reads poetry and really meditates on it, and going out into nature can be a way to really draw things that are spiritually meaningful and deep. So there's all different kinds of exercises, I think, that develop that exercise this region. But if you're a person that's already kind of in the habit of doing a lot of reading and meditating and those sorts of things, can you provide some suggestions on specifically theosophical texts that might be good for maybe of an introductory nature that would help work in this direction as far as this particular exercise?
Yeah. Well, it depends on, again, what level you are at. The idea is always try to get always something that makes you think, that makes you wonder. So, for example, Besant's book, A Study in Consciousness, is a very deep book. It begins rather with some tough chapters. So if you don't get anything out of them, don't worry, just keep going, see what insights you may get out of it. That's another thing with Theosophical books. The ones that are not introductory is for you to work with them, not to get concepts. Getting concepts is secondary. Just work with them and be happy with whatever insights you may get. Don't expect to be able to understand them all. So that book is an interesting book to do this. Of course, The Secret Doctrine. If you go without expectations, you just open a page and see what insights you can get. Use it as a gym, again, not as a story that you are going to get and be able to repeat. But if those books are too hard, because they also have a technical language that we need to learn. Sometimes it's not that we don't understand the concepts, we don't know what the terms mean. That happens with any philosophy. Start reading Kant or Schopenhauer or whoever, So you will have you need some time to get familiar with the language. Also, different traditions use words differently. This is something very important to keep in mind when you study. Don't assume that words have the same meaning. So, for example, in Theosophy, we use the Sanskrit word antahkarana, which is the meaning is completely different to the antahkarana in Hinduism. So if you know the Hindu concept and you read Theosophical literature, you will be confused. If you know the Theosophical meaning and then you read Hindu literature with that meaning, you will be confused. Within the same tradition, Besant uses terms in a way like astral body, which is different from Blavatsky's. And between different traditions, they assume that something that I always, give the advice, put things in boxes. That seems counterintuitive, but I do that with all the authors that I read. I read Blavatsky, I have my Blavatsky box, and I understand Blavatsky on its own. Then Besant, I have my Besant box. Then you can see what connections are there. But that keeps your clarity. And when you go outside the tradition, that's even more important. They may be using the same words, but the meaning can be completely different. And because we do comparative study, that is the weakness of comparative study. That is the shadow, the danger, that you have a mental salad. Because one person is using a word, in one way, in one tradition, another person is using the same word in another tradition, and then you just don't have a clear idea in your mind. Today, words like initiation and subtle bodies and, all these things are used by many, many traditions, and they are often used in very different ways. The first initiation in one tradition is not the first initiation in another tradition, or initiation in Freemasonry is not the same, So keep that in mind.
There are times when you might discover you have some spare time, let's say if the power is off, and you have time, but you don't have a book, and maybe there's not enough light to read by. In meditation, I'm interested in your comments on the practice of, let's say you have something like a mantra, but not just a mantra. It's like a prayer that's really designed to do something. And so rather than just recite it for the fun of reciting it, you're using it in your mind because you want to complete this stanza. Okay? And of course, you're going to lose your way. You know, you get about 3 words into it, and something reminds you of something else, and now you're thinking about the grocery list or something. So you have to come back, and you often, in my experience, you have to come back and come back and come back and come back. It's not the same as using a book that's teaching you something, but it might still be of value in the mental discipline part.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will talk about meditation later. But in particular with mantras, the Theosophical approach is similar to what Patanjali recommends in the Yoga Sutras. So he says, for example, when repeating the Om, he says, repeat the Om and meditate on its meaning. Now, I know some scholars translate it a little differently. You know, Sanskrit has that quality that is very flexible, and you can put it in different ways. But you know, there are some traditions where there is japa, that is the constant repetition. You don't need to think of the meaning. And, you know, that practice produces its own results. Again, there are different approaches, and some are better or some are less good for different people. In the Theosophical tradition, what is important is to use mantras as a seed of thought. The mantra itself, if it is designed for the sound of the mantra to produce an effect in your aura, the sound itself will produce an effect. The effect is like harmonizing the different bodies, but then if you don't use your mind to raise your consciousness through those bodies that are aligned, it's like you are doing all the work to align them by the sound of the mantra, but then you stay sitting in the lower floor. You know, so if you use a mantra, meditate on the meaning, and yes, that's the same as studying.
Pablo, with the development of the mind, it seems that one of the effects is that it causes excessive talking, and usually self-referential talking, which prevents us from real connection, connecting with others, connecting with nature, and it's very, very common to find in spiritual circles that excessive talk that becomes almost like a shell, like a self-centeredness that closes us from. It's very rare to find people with whom a person can actually connect. So, what would you? Can you add something about that?
Yes, all these developments have their shadows, as I mentioned in the lecture. And I think the problem is when we get stuck on one level, then we overemphasize that development. Your development becomes lopsided, and then that's when you fall into those weaknesses or shadows. So I think this is why in the Theosophical tradition there is this idea of holistic growth. We need to develop all areas of our nature. There is an article by HPV right now. I don't remember if it is the one. I think it's the one that is called Spiritual Growth. But she mentions that normally people tend to go too much through the line of least resistance, following too much your way, and then they produce a lopsided development in their personality, which starts distorting your perception, and it will be productive of pain and suffering. So she says we should follow how the body grows. It's not that our head grows first, and then our right arm, and then the left leg. We grow in a more holistic way. So that's why I think this ladder is important, because the idea is to work on all these aspects. And then, of course, depending on your way, you will have a general tendency or general approach, but then you have to develop all of that. There are some quotes by Besant that I remember right now, where she talks against those people who develop too much their devotional aspect and are repelled by intellectual effort. And then there are quotes where she says the opposite. Those people who are just stuck on the mental and then they don't bring the devotional and aspirational aspect in their lives, and they are stuck too. So I think trying to develop holistically is the answer.
So Pablo, I wanted to talk a little bit about the boxes that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that this is something that you do and something that you know that goes beyond that, and that it's helpful, especially for the concrete mind that wants concrete definitions of things, to put things in boxes and keep them separate from each other. But for my own practice in terms of reading, and I want to just suggest this as another step beyond what has been coming up in these slides, I try to feel into the function of the word or the definition or the passage that I'm reading, because it emanates from an energetic experience that if you can identify it, then you can start seeing the similarities that are present across all other fields that use either the same term or a different term for the same concept. So for me, for example, the practice of reading the Secret Doctrine is primarily focused on the question of why are there all these apparent digressions? And my experience is that if I sit with them, I come to a place of understanding in myself that understands how they all emanate from the concept that's being discussed more concretely in the in-between passages. Mm-hmm. So that an abridged version of the Secret Doctrine that takes out all the quotes because they're not relevant would completely defeat the purpose of what Blavatsky was doing, which was not just to develop the concrete mind, but also to go beyond that and develop the intuition.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, and that aspect, we will look at that. That's when you start working on the abstract mind, that is the one that seeks commonalities behind the diversity of presentations or objects. So, of course, you don't stop at having your concepts in these boxes. That's just the beginning. And just for a pragmatic reason, you know, if you think that you are used to reading Besant and think astral body is the emotional body, and then you read Blavatsky and she uses astral body for what Besant uses etheric double, and you don't know that, then you just won't be able to understand what Blavatsky says. And when you read other traditions, again, if you don't clarify what they mean by those words, the same will happen. So this putting in boxes is just the first step, and for that pragmatic reason. Then we have to go beyond concepts, and then we can see the commonalities and all that, which we will explore later.
Let's say that a person becomes aware of negative thinking or scattered thoughts that are going on, and they want to, through an active volition or an active choice, shift the focus to a more positive. There's methods of mantra, breath work, reading spiritual texts to help do that. Are there any other methods? What methods would you suggest to be able to, through an active choice or volition, to simply shift the focus from one object to another, from negative scatter to the new thinking?
I mean, there are many methods, and we don't have time to go into that here. But one method is what you said: turn your mind into a direction that the mind feels attracted to, that makes it easier, whether it is gardening or chanting a mantra or something like that. If possible, what is recommended also as better than that method is to start reflecting on the opposite, because then you start generating in your aura an activity of consciousness that will tend to repel the kind of thought that you are trying to not give into. So you polarize your consciousness in a different way. But sometimes that's not that easy, because if the thought comes with a mood, then you have to have quite a bit of willpower to push into the opposite direction. Also, if you work with awareness, you just relax into the thought, you observe it as a silent witness. if you do it right, the thought disappears on its own. There are many approaches, but that is a whole program in itself. All right, so let us continue now with the second step, that is from the lower mind to the aspiring mind. Aspiring mind is the translation that I use for what Blavatsky would call manas antahkarana. So as we saw in the lecture, there is a function of the lower mind, the concrete mind. When the concrete mind is aspiring to the higher, then the mind enters into a higher state of consciousness, and that's what Blavatsky calls manas antahkarana, or the aspiring mind. So this is a quote: "Antahkarana is active only during those moments when the concrete mind aspires towards its higher half and thus becomes the medium of communication between the two." Again, understand antahkarana with this definition in the Theosophical context. Hinduism uses that word differently, other traditions that may use this word, because after the TS was founded, this language became, especially in Western esotericism, became kind of, famous or whatever it is. And many later teachers used this language. But they use this language to share their own insights, and sometimes they use these words in their own way. So again, you have to be careful to understand what each author means by these terms. Okay, so what does it mean to aspire to the higher? Of course, there can be an intellectual aspiration, but basically this is the place where the higher emotions have their main role. And sometimes people misunderstand the idea, perhaps because of the ascetic traditions. Asceticism is that kind of approach where the person tries to detach himself or herself from all attachments, from, all needs as much as possible. And sometimes the idea is to stop feeling. Now, the Theosophical approach doesn't endorse that at all. Actually, there is a piece of writing where Annie Besant says, don't try to kill desire or kill your emotions, because if you kill the emotions or desire, you also kill your capacity for love. So you will become cold, insensitive, isolated. That's why she always encourages this transmutation. Anyway, so Annie Besant says the spiritual nature is to be stimulated into activity. The soul is to be helped in its growth. The attitude of love, of worship, of aspiration is necessary for the growth of the soul. So you see, this is a difference this is different from how meditation is taught today in a secular context. I mean, I think it's good that they are teaching meditation even in a secular context. Is better than not teaching meditation at all. And it's reaching some people who otherwise wouldn't embrace this. But just the idea of sitting and watch your breath, or, whatever the technique may be, so that you release stress, so that you sharpen your mind and you develop a focused mind, all that approach is great for those purposes, but generally speaking, it's not going to help the growth of the soul. And sometimes spiritual practitioners are influenced by that kind of approach, and maybe their meditations may be too secular. Of course, if we are earnest, we can recite the name of a rock and we can attain enlightenment. If we are really earnest, the methods, the techniques are aids for our growth. What really produces the growth is your earnestness. But there are methods who can help more effectively that earnestness than other methods. So the idea here is bring into your life this aspect, the attitude of love, of worship, of aspiration. So if we are talking about meditation, consider starting your meditation with an attitude of aspiration and worship or offering. If you are let's say, you are inspired by the Theosophical tradition, you may offer your practice to the master, for example. Or if you belong to some other tradition and they have their own deities or divine incarnations, you can offer it to that. You can invoke also your soul, if that helps you have an attitude of aspiration and worship. So you can invoke your soul, and you can do it again in the language that is meaningful to you. A theosophist could say something, for example, that may be meaningless to another person. I don't know, monadic self in the causal body, I invoke your presence in my consciousness. I mean, if those words mean something to you, great, But if for somebody those are, just words, don't use that. Don't copy what somebody does. Now, this I see very often when we use traditions that may be foreign to us. They have their own meditations on their own deities, etc. Unless you feel drawn to that tradition, probably meditating on these foreign deities or divine incarnations is not going to produce a sense of worship, aspiration, devotion. So find what lightens your devotion and incorporate it in your life, not only in meditation, but also in your daily life. So, for example, Leadbeater says, the readiest and safest method of developing the higher consciousness is to begin each morning by spending a few minutes in meditation, which is intended to be devoted to aspiration towards the masters, or the higher self, if you are not familiar with the idea of the masters of wisdom, or you don't have a sense of devotion for them. I mean, we all should find what we are devoted to. As I mentioned in my lecture, we live in a terribly secular society. Our heroes are sport people, singers, etc., which cannot produce this kind of devotion. So sometimes when I teach meditation that requires this, and I tell people, okay, bring up an image that generates devotion, aspirations, they don't have any. Maybe they were Christians and they are burned by the experience, so they cannot think of Jesus or Mother Mary if they are Catholics. So work actively in your life to develop that kind of aspiration. I mean, living spiritual teachers can fulfill that place, that role. Now, be careful if you aspire or if you are devoted to living spiritual teachers, because living spiritual teachers are human beings. They are flawed. They have, they are going to disappoint you if you use them thinking that they are perfect or, so it is easier to generate devotion for somebody that that you can relate to, but be careful about that. Or you can have as aspiration like a master or things of that nature. Then Annie Besant says, when the prayer, so prayer, is part of this. When we are invoking, when we are offering, is a kind of prayer that can be your practice can be just that, or it can be in the context of your meditation. When the prayer is for spiritual enlightenment, for spiritual growth, when you are invoking your soul to illumine your mind, to bring its presence into your awareness. The longing of the upward aspiring heart, she's talking, when you are aspiring, the longing for such growth liberates energy of a higher kind, the spiritual longing calling forth an answer from the spiritual realm. So there is this question that knock and, the door will be open, that it has this esoteric meaning. If you aspire to touch the higher, there will be a response from the higher. So in your own way, see how you can incorporate that in your life. It can be very, again, we are all different. It can be a very intellectual devotion, but that can be effective too. You may have devotion to the idea of unity, and not an emotional devotion in the sense of we are all one, but unity because that's the reality, and your mind may be attracted to unity as a reality without necessarily a lot of emotions, but that is also an aspiration. If you have emotions because emotions make things move, then an emotion of this kind is very helpful in meditation, in your spiritual life. But again, don't copy anybody. You have to see what your nature is and how you can incorporate these aspects according to your own nature. So once more, the law of sympathetic vibrations asserts itself, and the note of lofty aspiration is answered by a vibration synchronous or in sympathy with that aspiration, with itself. The divine life is ever pressing against the limits which bind it. And when the upward rising force, that aspiring mind, strikes against those limits, the separating wall is broken through and the life floods the soul. So the spiritual aspect in us is always trying to reach the personality. But there is a gap, a chasm, which is because we as the personality are not lifting up our hand to the divine. So when we do that, there is this effect that Annie Besant is explaining here. And then there are books that can help you with this. Again, Besant says, we are apt to read too exclusively for knowledge and lose the molding force that lofty thought on great ideals may exercise over our emotions. So you can stimulate your emotions by means of reading. Now, of course, in this case, the kind of books that you will use are different from the books for knowledge or intellectual development that we were talking about. So she says, help may be gained by reading any book that strikes a noble note of life, whether by lifting up a great ideal or presenting an inspiring character for our study. Such books as the Bhagavad Gita, The Voice of the Silence, Light on the Path, The Imitation of Christ, and there are obviously many others, are among the most powerful of such aids to the desired nature. These books are appealing our emotional aspect, but the highest of the emotional aspect. So you see, presenting an inspiring character, biographies, are very helpful for this. And this is how what I was saying, we don't have personalities that are inspiring for us, generally speaking, in our culture. So biographies of mystics or theosophists or spiritual teachers or people, human beings who did great things, they all help to stimulate that aspect. And you may start your meditation reading something or these kind of books, and let yourself be inspired. Let yourself be, your higher emotions be stimulated. So Besant says this, it is a useful habit to read every morning a few sentences from some such book as those named above, and to carry these sentences with us through the day, thus creating around us an atmosphere that is protective to ourselves and beneficial to all with whom we come into contact. This is the idea of what morning meditation or contemplation or aspiration does to us. It sets a certain state of consciousness that can remain with us throughout the day. And this is a question of practice. At the beginning, we may lose it the moment that we start preparing our coffee after meditation. But then with practice, that begins, this constant, Besant would always say, constancy is the key. Meditate 5 minutes a day, but every day, rather than half an hour one day, then you don't, then an hour another day, because that constancy creates a pattern in your consciousness that then you bring with you. That pattern is constantly trying to keep your consciousness elevated, And when you come in touch with other people, you have the same effect in those people. So it's a form of service. You want to help people generate strongly in your nature this pattern, and then you will be radiating that. So any comments, questions about this?
In the beginning there you had a quote about Antahkarana. And in another place, I don't remember exactly in which book, Blavatsky said that Antahkarana is in a way like a figure of speech, that it's not real and it doesn't exist in the way as we would think that it exists. And at the same time, she uses it to explain some things. And well, the good thing for her, in a way, with her was that she explained things from the standpoint of trying to make things easier for us, because also she says there is just one manas, there is no lower, no higher. But for us, on our level, it helps us to understand things when we separate higher and lower. So what do you think, what is the reason why she brought into the teachings this idea of Antahkarana, if, on the other hand, she says that this is just a figure of speech and it doesn't exist the way we think it would?
Yeah. I think you are referring to something she wrote in the esoteric instructions. And the way that I understood it is that she was saying, because she talks about Antahkarana as a bridge. Now, she was saying it's not a real bridge, it's not a structure. I think she mentions that also in the inner group teachings, where somebody asked if the Antahkarana was like just like we have the silver cord, from the etheric double, keeping it united to the body. That's a real structure. So they were asking if Antahkarana was something like that, like a structure that was uniting the higher and the lower mind. So in those two sources, she says, no, it's not a real structure. It's a state of consciousness. So all these things, all these divisions, are simply states of consciousness of one single principle that is manas, which is what you are saying. We go through many states of consciousness during our lives, and when we put names, there is another thing she writes in the esoteric instruction, if I remember correctly, and she says, in occultism, we give a different name to each different state of the same thing. And that's why, ultimately speaking, it's all a unity. Manas is Atman acting on the mental plane, but we call it manas, So that's an important thing to keep in mind. When we talk about all these levels, we are talking about different states of the same thing. Thanks.
This question is more related to your previous discussion about developing the mind, right? I'm trying to reconcile in my mind what seems to be contradictory in this versus what we heard yesterday. Yesterday, when we talked about the 4 basic steps, it seemed like the message was to not listen to the mind, actually quieten the mind so that you can actually listen to the buddhi. And today, in developing, in this conversation, the earlier conversation, it seems like we want to develop our lower mind so that it can reach the higher mind, so we have to contemplate. So there's a lot of focus on the mind itself. So which of this is, how do I reconcile this?
Yeah. As we proceed with the class, you will see we will get to the part where the mind is left behind. In general, what you see in Theosophical literature is that, and this is a problem often found, I think, when reading Krishnamurti, or non-dual traditions for that matter. If you are going to move from manas to buddhi, you need to quiet manas. Now, is that all you need to do in the spiritual life? Is everybody able to do that? Or is there some previous development that will allow you to do that? So that's how normally the Theosophical literature deals with this. You need to generate some previous work that allows you to do that when you get to that stage, when you develop that ability. Because one problem that I see in modern spirituality with this idea that meditation is quieting the mind, I just published an article about this in the Theosophist in April this year, I think. It's available online. The Nature of Theosophical Meditation is called. So I'll say this briefly and you can see the whole argument there. But if you sit and you quiet your mind, you are basically quieting the concrete mind. Your consciousness is at the level of the concrete mind, that is the lower mental plane, or the desire mind, if that's your state of consciousness, that is, in the kamic plane. And when you keep the mind quiet, you become sensitive to what is around you. So if you try to quiet the mind from the beginning, then you are going to be sensitive to the realities and energies of the lower planes, because that's where your consciousness is. So in the Theosophical approach, you first raise your center of consciousness, and then you quiet it, because then you will be receptive to the spiritual realities. So sure, quieting the mind is the key step to get to the spiritual nature. But in the oversimplification that is always part of anything that becomes more massive, that is normally lost sight of. And then we have some effects that are not great. So when Krishnamurti talks about transcending the thinker and thought and all that, that's exactly what we need to do. But can you do it? Or if you have a feeble mind, this happened in my own life. I tried to practice what Krishnamurti was saying, and then my emotions would be there. I tried to pay attention to them, and I couldn't pay attention. I got drawn into them. I got distracted. I would fight them. Then I thought, wait a second, can I hold my mind steadily anywhere? So I sat in front of a tree, and I couldn't hold my attention, to the tree without getting distracted. So if I can't pay steady attention to a tree, how can I pay steady attention to the emotions that are so challenging? So then I realized, wait, I have to develop this skill first before I can apply it to this. So in my own life, I see that working on these levels was necessary. Then if you have, I got into the TS relatively young. I was 20. So maybe if I had developed this outside of the TS, then when I came to the TS, maybe I would not have seen how necessary these things are, because I developed them in a different way. We are all different, but I have seen that we need, if we want to be successful in really raising our consciousness, these skills have to be with us, whether because we bring them from a previous life or we train them in this one.
Going back to devotion in connection to meditation, I have found that longing can be the key to discovering where to focus our devotion, even if it's small. We all have a deepest longing, and that longing takes a form in a word, and that can be the guide into which we can connect.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, probably that longing gets purified and higher, like everything. I think that we get where we are trying to go in this, not what our mind imagines that we are trying to go, but if we normally start meditation, start the spiritual life with a personal, purpose. I'm tired of suffering. I want something that helps me not suffer, and I do that because I don't want to suffer. So that's normal. And the intellectual approach, maybe just for myself. The devotional approach, maybe just for myself. And that is a helpful, force. And then if we are mature, we discover that our longing can be deeper. Our intention in understanding can be deeper. So yes, I would say try to see what's the highest longing that you are capable of. Besant would often say, ideals are only helpful if they inspire you. If you are presented with an ideal that is too high, it's not going to work for you. It will leave you cold. You will feel guilty that you cannot reach that. Ideas have to be that thing which is just beyond yourself and that has the power to inspire you. So I think that can work with the longing, and you tell me what you think about it. So see what's the highest longing that you can frame that contains that kind of inspiration, and work on that. And later you may discover a higher longing, and then you shift, you follow the longing.
A question from online, and this goes back a little bit earlier, but I think it fits in here. It's natural for the lower self to value things such as feeling proud of accomplishments. Is it possible to move to a higher level even with this baggage?
Yes, I mean, it is possible. All stages are natural. What we need to be careful is not to get stuck on any stage. You know, the go beyond, go even beyond. So we always need to take the next step that is possible for us. So as I was saying, at the beginning, we naturally start doing things for ourselves, and we may feel happy in a personal way. And, you know, in meditation, your mind will, at the beginning, will need some proof that this is working, and will cling to stupid little things like saying, okay, I'm advancing, I'm growing. And that's fine. If that is necessary, that's fine. But always aim, as I was saying, for the highest that you can perceive. And eventually, as you grow deeper, you begin to realize that you don't need to stimulate the lower self any longer. And that you stop having those needs. Therefore, you don't need that. So if you try to follow the spiritual life earnestly, this all happens naturally. And when you don't have those personal needs, then you are free to longing in a purer way. But if you have personal needs, ignoring them is not going to make them go away. So that's why we need to work on all of this and gradually mature. So don't be disappointed if that is there. Be aware of it. Work with it, and work to understand it. Work to try to elevate your ideas, as we were talking about, and you'll discover one day that that thing doesn't exist in you any longer.